Today we are talking to Dr. Nathaniel Baum-Snow. He is a professor of economic analysis and policy at the University of Toronto Rotman School of Management and an author of several recent papers that studied the growth of housing in the cities in North America. A quick political bias disclaimer. Although I am a member of the Canadian Future Party, Nathaniel is not, and all of his opinions are his own. Now with that, let's begin. Nathaniel, thank you for coming. Great to have you here.
Glad to be here.
So first question is, with the high house prices and high rents in many cities in the United States and Canada, a lot of attention has been placed on the housing supply. And I've seen that you've done a fair bit of work looking at the housing supply. And so could you talk about your work and what are some of your biggest takeaways?
Sure, absolutely. So I have a recent published paper that tries to understand better the extent to which construction of new housing and renovations and reconfigurations of existing housing respond to prices, to price growth. We've seen a lot of house price growth both in Canada and the US over the past decade or so, 20 years or so. And so this is really an important question, really, to understand how easy developers and builders find it to respond to these price signals and provide the housing that people are demanding. And so one of the striking results from the study is just that there's very little construction response, and this is why prices are rising so quickly. So on average, sort of across neighborhoods in the US, which is the setting of our study, if prices grow by 10%, you see about 5% more housing units built, or 5% increase in the quantity of housing, which is a pretty small response and kind of historically small response. The other thing is there's quite a bit of variation, as you can imagine, across locations, both within and between cities. But in particular within cities, most of the responses are coming in at the urban peripheries, at the exurbs, in areas that are not heavily built up yet. And you think about it a bit, this sort of explains how these numbers can be so low. The process of suburbanization and decentralization of cities is kind of largely complete now. There was a lot of highway construction, a lot of infrastructure expansion, in the 60s and 70s into the 80s, kind of finishing up in the 90s. And that opened up a lot of land for development, for housing development. And it took, a few decades for that development to take place and people to move into their new suburban single-family homes in locations that were somewhat accessible to employment destinations. And I think that process is kind of completed. And now there isn't a lot of new infrastructure expansion, especially into areas that are undeveloped, where there's land available for development. And that's meant that the cost of developing new housing has gone up a lot. And as a result, we don't see as much of a quantity response to price signals, to increases in prices as we've seen in the past. And I think the same thing applies to Canadian cities. Canada has done somewhat better than the US in facilitating infill multifamily development. And so I think Canada deserves, Canadian policymakers deserve a fair amount of credit for that. But nonetheless, we see a lot of the same patterns in Canadian metros as well. I guess the other thing I would say on Canada is the demand pressure through population growth has been stronger in Canada than the US. And that's a big part of the reason why, housing prices have been rising in Canada, especially Toronto and Vancouver, so quickly.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the interesting things I have seen in your papers is that in United States also different cities have responded differently as well.
Yeah.
And with some cities still being able to build out more housing, especially in the Sun Belt, while some of the bigger traditional cities have not.
Yeah, so I think a lot of that is driven by two things. One is land available for development, and the other is regulation. And I think both matter to some extent. And certainly our evidence indicates that both matter to some extent, but land available for development is sort of probably the biggest factor. And I think the two go together. When there's a lot of land available for development, the suburbs are not totally built up yet. The regulatory regimes that limit construction and development tend to be less well established because the level of government that is responsible for housing and land use regulation tends to be higher, tends to be either the state or the county level more than the municipality level because a lot of these places are not incorporated yet. And I think that's kind of also what we see in Canada. You look at Ontario, the provincial government has been quite proactive in trying to make development easier and to the point of essentially overruling local development restrictions.
Right. In
Uh,
British Columbia as well, from what I've seen.
yeah, yeah. I think if I know Toronto better than Vancouver, but certainly in Toronto, I think it's the case if the city had full control over limiting development and residential housing market regulation, there would have been much less construction in the last 20 years. And the province has has not exactly the same goals as the city. The provincial government thinks about the fact that allowing the city of Toronto to grow will allow the economy of the whole province to grow. And that's good for people outside of Toronto. And Toronto is going to be more responsive, of course, to just the more local interests of not having, too much congestion and overcrowded schools and, traffic problems and jammed subways and things. So I think it's totally logical that there is some differences in interests about regulation at different levels of government. And in the US, the places that have been more successful at allowing more construction tend to be administered at a higher level of government that is going to be less, in some sense, less responsive to very local concerns. So that might be a negative, but also less constraining.
Interesting. So I guess one of the takeaways then is that if control over land use policy is too local, then it starts to kind of undermine the ability to build additional housing by the sound of it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of evidence of this. So, local control, the interests of incumbent, especially property owners, single family or homeowners in particular, owner occupants, is not to allow development. That's both good for their own property values and potentially good for, kind of the maintaining the amenity value of the neighborhood that they bought into. Allowing more development anywhere but on your own property is going to increase supply, which drives down prices, which makes your own property less valuable. And so there's an incentive, perfectly logical financial incentive for homeowners to want to limit development for that reason. And the people who are hurt are the people who, would like to move into the area, but can't afford to do so as a result of the high housing costs.
Yeah, for sure. And the other thing that I have seen in one of your papers is that it looked like the ability for the housing supply to respond to demand was also partly driven by the availability of plots of land in the neighborhoods. Does that mean that opening up more, let's say, either industrial lands or any other lands for development is part of potential answer?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So this comes to land use regulation. Again, we have large tracts of land that historically were manufacturing areas and industrial areas, and they maintain that zoning, which is you could think of as almost a subsidy to industry because it tends to be smaller firms, light manufacturing, that sort of those sorts of firms that essentially get lower rent for these types of properties because they're not allowed to be converted into residential use. And there isn't that much, manufacturing demand. At least it's much lower than it used to be. This is in more interior areas of cities that don't have great highway accessibility. Those areas, I think there's this hope by local policymakers that they can be, revitalized as manufacturing centers or something. And this is good for employment opportunities. But at the same time, these employment lands, the fact that they're not allowed to be redeveloped into housing helps keep housing costs high. There's no question. The types of industrial properties that are near highways have become much more valuable and I think are not probably so subject to being converted to residential, at least based on demand conditions because of the rise of warehousing and e-commerce. Amazon is building all these distribution centers, but they have to be located in places with good transport accessibility. So I think there are indeed a lot of employment lands that, I mean, Toronto's actually been pretty good at converting a lot of them over to residential, allow dense residential development, but there could be more of that. And certainly in the US, there's, I think, a lot of opportunity for that sort of thing
Right.
to
In
occur.
Toronto specifically, I guess the waterfront specifically comes to mind as a success story for that.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. The Downsview Airport site near downtown, the DuPont Street corridor. There's a bunch of locations like that, which, were industrial that are now being built up as residential. Now that does come with teething problems, like you got to have the enough of the infrastructure there to support that residential development. I mean, I know that they're replacing a bunch of the water mains under major streets because the old water mains from the 19th century when they were originally put in near downtown at least just can't handle the higher usage that comes with all these condos.
Totally makes sense. And I guess schools and community centers and all the rest as well.
Yeah, right.
What was interesting also that it looked like in US, though, in many of the Sunbelt cities, there is still a lot of suburban construction going on. It looked
Yes.
like.
Actually, that's where almost all of the new construction is taking place.
Looking at the whole picture, stepping back, does that also mean that they might also at some point run out of space or willingness to build more
Yeah, so
urban?
in fact, we see this happening already. So after 2010, the rate of new construction in these suburban areas where the vast majority of new housing units were being supplied declined a lot, and it hasn't recovered nearly to the point it was at in between, say, there was the financial crisis, the housing crisis, but between the 2000 to 2005 period, that was like the height of construction, and it was mostly in these suburban areas, and we're nowhere near back to that level. We're something at like 25% of that level or something now. And so this is something that the White House Council of Economic Advisors has noticed and is concerned about. This is a real issue, and I think uh, a lot of it has to do with just this fact that the best tracts of land with the best accessibility have been built out now. And it's once you build a neighborhood, it's very, very hard to densify it, especially in the U.S. kind of political system of very local zoning and land use regulation. So I think a lot of it's just this kind of selection issue that they were finishing up building out the areas that had reasonably good accessibility in these large metros like Phoenix and Dallas that were growing very quickly at the time. And now just the land that's available for development is not in very good locations that with good road accessibility mostly. And so, developers don't are having a harder time finding good places to develop. And plus subdividing lots and densifying already built up areas is just very difficult. And as a result, it's rare.
Yeah, the existing residents, as you have mentioned, tend to resist it
Yeah,
heavily.
exactly.
Another thing I have noticed in one of your papers, I forget which one, is that smaller and medium-sized cities seem to grow more than the big ones.
Yeah.
Is that the potential answer as well to meeting the housing needs?
I mean, right. So these are places where demand is a bit weaker, but costs are a lot lower because they still do have land available for development in accessible locations. You look at on the outskirts of smaller cities, even in somewhat places that are not growing economically that quickly. And you see, the cornfields around Des Moines, around Cedar Rapids, Omaha. These are places, these are all getting paved over, right? And you see, the outskirts of Calgary, that's happened too, right? Though Calgary's been doing a bit better than Des Moines, and Omaha's been doing reasonably well. So yeah, these types of cities that if we're just worried about housing supply, like I agree, I think these are probably the future, especially if we constrain ourselves to living in single family homes and driving everywhere. That's got to be the future because the big cities have kind of been built out and they've become too congested to handle, a lot more residents living in that sort of way. Yeah, I think that's right. It comes with an economic cost of, you know, not having the accessibility to kind of the most productive cities, the Torontos and Vancouvers and New Yorks of the world. But, something's got to give at some point. And I think it is totally reasonable for these medium-sized cities to be growing to take on some of this housing demand.
I guess it also helps with the work from home, where
Yeah,
you don't necessarily need to commute to
that's for sure.
the.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's for sure. And that's driven, honestly, that's driven some of this demand growth in these medium-sized cities as well.
I have seen this here in our area in the southern Ontario during COVID, where in small cities like Kitchener, Welland, house prices shot up during COVID
Yeah.
as people moved out
And
there.
and they declined in the center in downtown Toronto.
Right. Yeah. So I guess circling back to the bigger picture, what do you think are the biggest takeaways for the policymakers that would help us meet the housing demand sooner?
Yeah, so I think so honestly, I would say I think the Canadian policymakers at the provincial level have done a reasonably good job of recognizing the problem. I think, in BC, you see this movement towards allowing ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and also in California. I think that's probably not, there isn't a lot of evidence that's moved the needle a lot because the lower cost way of developing new housing is at scale. And so anytime you're looking for new construction to be kind of like little infill projects that each are kind of bespoke and different from the other, it's very expensive. You need the scale of large buildings or large tracts of undeveloped land in order to have the cost of construction be low enough that it could possibly bring in housing units that are cheap enough for sort of middle income households, like you see with condos, right? Now
Right.
there's this issue with condos that I think a lot of them have been built to to satisfy investor demand, and they in terms of livability, they're only appropriate for kind of single people or young people who are willing to share relatively small units.
It's in Toronto specifically, those 300 square foot condos.
Yes, exactly. It's maybe a bit of a shame we could have built half as many 600 square foot condos and maybe improved housing supply more for kind of the segment of demand that would have been willing to pay for it. But I think but there's a positive side to that too, is that a lot of those condos have been built. And it is possible to do this. The city of Toronto showed that. And also the whole GTA, the whole Toronto area showed that. But they only did happen sort of at a large enough scale that you had, developers able to build multifamily, being able to do this. And there are some areas in the more like even around Yonge and Eglinton, there's more condos that were built around there that are for actual people to live in, that are large enough to accommodate people. And so I think part of the policy challenge and opportunity is to find a way to transition, especially Toronto and Vancouver, into being more cities of condos and apartments from being cities of single family homes, right? Which means building out the infrastructure to facilitate that, the transit, which is happening, though less efficiently than it should be, and making it, easier to build in certain areas where the infrastructure is able to accommodate the density. And so I think honestly the Toronto area has done maybe the best on that front of any area in North America. It's not perfect, but it's definitely allowed enough construction to accommodate pretty rapid population growth.
Yeah, thank you. And that was largely it. We said our goodbyes and ended the call there. Hey, if you're still here, why don't you press like and subscribe? And if you're in Canada, check out the Canadian Future Party. Well, see you next time.